Here in Topic 8, we're going to talk about Charlemagne and his vision for a Christian society. And just to tell you where we are in those three stages of church history, we are at the end of the first stage. We're getting ready with Charlemagne to move into part two of Christian history, which is the medieval period. Charlemagne's story is part of the Carolingian narrative. And it really begins with an individual named Pepin the Short. You can imagine why he was given the title the Short. It's a literal title because he's short. He reigned from 751 to 768, and the problem with Pepin is it wasn't clear if he actually had a right to the throne. In other words, he had a very weak bloodline. And if you read fantasy novels or you watch Game of Thrones, you realize that if you have a weak bloodline, this is problematic because somebody can come along and question that or say, I have a stronger claim to the throne than you. Well, being absolutely no dummy, Pepin goes to Pope Zacharias, whose years of reign were 741 to 752. And he appeals to Pope Zacharias and says, look, I need you to decide who gets to be the German king of the Frankish territories. Basically what Pepin is saying is, if you, Pope Zacharias, say I have the rightful claim to the throne, everybody will believe it. Now, there's some quid pro quo going on here. There's a lot of politics going on here. What happens is Pepin the Short is raised on shields by his warriors, and he's anointed by Bishop Boniface at Soissons. And this public display in which a bishop anoints Pepin as the true ruler, the true king, is very, very important because it means that the church is accepting Pepin as ruler. It's acknowledging him as ruler. But this works out well for the Pope, for Zacharias, and for a bishop like Boniface, because it means that Pepin, the governmental authority, is acknowledging the superiority of the Pope and the papacy. Now, obviously, this is going to become a problem later on, but here you have an example of where a leader realizes, I have to appeal to church authority to solidify my own authority. There are going to be other examples where the church is going to have to come running back to government authority because it needs help. But what Pepin did here is he got what he wanted, he became the German king, and at the same time his action acknowledged the superiority of the Pope. Pope Stephen II, whose years are 752 to 757, or at least the years that he reigned as Pope, has to do the opposite of what Pepin did. If Pepin is turning to the Pope, Pope Stephen is somebody that's going to have to turn to the king in order to get help. When Rome is being invaded, Stephen II turns to the north to ask for help. What's happened is Islam has cut off all contact that Pope Stephen has with the church in Constantinople, with the eastern part of the empire. Relations with the East, the Latin church and the Greek church had gotten really, really bad. Remember, there is a point in time where they end up excommunicating one another. Stephen knows that Pepin owes Pope Zacharias his throne. So Stephen goes back to Pepin and says, I need you to come down and protect us. We did you a favor once, so you need to do a favor for us. So Pepin shows up, throws out the enemies of the Pope, and gives the land, which become known as the Papal States, to the Pope. And then he has Stephen II anoint him again, himself and his sons, in Rome. So all these gestures are going back and forth, where this could be viewed as upholding the authority or the superiority of the papacy. It could also be seen as, the papacy isn't as powerful as we thought, because when it gets in trouble, it has to go to the king and ask the king to come and help. Well, the main individual in this period that's going to shape history for a while is Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. His years are 768 to 814. Charlemagne is the great son from this dynasty that goes all the way back to Charles Martel. He throws out the enemies of the Pope, known as the Lombards. And when Pope Leo III in 799 is thrown out by a Roman mob, well, what does he do? He does what popes before him have done. He runs to Charlemagne for help. And again, this pattern is just repeating itself over and over again. The church will go to the king will go to the church. On Christmas Day, 800, because of what Charlemagne does for Pope Leo, because Charlemagne intervenes, and as the secular authority says, nope, Pope Leo is the rightful pope, you can't oust him from the papal throne, a very grateful Pope Leo III publicly crowns Charlemagne as the new Holy Roman Emperor, which creates from here on out the Holy Roman Empire. And I still remember this joke a professor of mine would say all the way back in undergrad. The irony of the Holy Roman Empire is that it's not holy, it's not Roman, and it's not an empire. But it continues to be called this because Charlemagne has a plan. But again, this is, you can see the symbolism here and even some confusion here of, well, wait a minute, if Leo crowns Charlemagne the Holy Roman Emperor, does that mean Leo has all of the power? But remember, Leo had to run to Charlemagne in order to be in power in the first place. When Charlemagne becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, the Carolingian Renaissance begins. Charlemagne takes his role as emperor very, very seriously. He goes back to an emperor like Constantine and starts using certain titles that older emperors used to use before the fall of Rome. He starts putting his image on coins. He starts using the imperial seal when he writes letters. He really wants to recreate the good old days of the Roman Empire, but with him in charge and with that empire being a Christian empire. The Latin for what is going on here is Renovatio Romani Imperii. It's the renewal of the Roman Empire. Now, this is going to cause further breaks with the East. The main city in the eastern part of the Roman Empire had always been the city of Constantine, the city of Constantinople. But with the rise of Charlemagne, Charlemagne is saying, no, it's all about Rome again. In fact, he goes so far as to adopt titles for himself, like Carolus, which means Carl or Charles, Rex Francorum et Lombardorum, which is Latin for Charles, king of the Frankish people and of the Lombards. And then he actually goes and starts taking titles from emperors as far back as the first emperor of Rome, Augustus, calling himself Carolus Augustus, the Blessed One, or the one to be worshipped. And he starts wearing the toga and the laurel crown. These are all old symbols of the Roman Empire, going back to Constantine, going back even to the first Roman emperor, Augustus, who was the Roman emperor when Jesus was born. Now, as you might guess, this is going to start making people nervous of just who does he think he is. In fact, it gets a bit more problematic because he starts using titles like Defensor Ecclesia, I am the defender of the church. He calls himself the 13th apostle, a very, very bold move. He takes on a title that's associated with the Pope, the Vicar of Christ, and St. Peter. He calls himself the rector of the Christian people and the rector of true religion. Rector is a term you often hear today in the Church of England, in the Episcopal Church. It's the rector is the priest of a parish, of a church. It's fascinating what Charlemagne is doing here, because he's essentially saying, no, even though Leo had to make me the Holy Roman Emperor, I'm really in charge. What Charlemagne saw himself doing was creating what is called a Societa Christiana. He's wanting to create the kingdom of God on earth. He's wanting to create a Christian society on earth, a Christian empire. This was something that Constantine seemed like he was going to do. Theodosius tried it. Obviously, eventually Rome falls, but Charlemagne thinks, I can do this. What happens in Charlemagne is the royal power and the priestly power come together. He gets rid of that two swords theory, that the church has one sword and the government has the other. He says, no, I, Charlemagne, have both of them. Now, some of what Charlemagne does for the church is really, really good, and this is perhaps why the church lets this go on for a while. He starts to give a lot of money for education. He wants an educated clergy. He improves the liturgy. He gives money for Bibles to be distributed. He gives money so people can study the writings of the church fathers. In fact, one of his tutors was a monk named Alcuin, 735 to 804. So it wasn't like Charlemagne was ignorant or didn't know Roman Catholic theology or history at this period of time. The second founder, Benedictine monasticism, Benedict of Aniane, 750 to 821, was the client of Charlemagne. Charlemagne was his patron. So Charlemagne was able to help out Benedictine monasticism and help it continue to thrive and grow. Even though he's using all these titles for himself, he does, at the behest of the church, start making laws in the empire that are based on Christian ideas and that are moral in tone. And of course, the bishops like this, the Pope likes this. Well, one of the problems here is that some of this is good and some of this is bad for the church. And this goes all the way back, of course, to Constantine. Is it a good thing that the church suddenly got all this power? Or is it bad? Well, the pros, of course, are when you have somebody like Charlemagne, the church suddenly has physical protection. It can go to Charlemagne and say, look, we're being attacked by Muslims. Send your army. There's plenty of money. There's plenty of land. There's plenty of resources. There are resources for missionaries to go and evangelize. And you get, and there's never anything wrong with this, you get an educated clergy that knows what they're doing when it comes to liturgy and so on and so forth. The con in this is that Charlemagne and all of his successors tell the church, in exchange for this, we get to appoint the next generation of leaders. We get to appoint bishops, and we get to appoint the abbots of monasteries. In other words, we're going to put in charge the people we want in charge, not the people you want in charge. What this means is that free canonical election is going to decline. The decision is now going to be in the hands of the government, not in the hands of the church. And it's very hard to keep an independent voice, to keep the integrity of those seven sacraments when the people in charge are appointed by somebody like Charlemagne and his successors. In fact, what's happening here is the checks and balance system is falling apart. This is eventually going to lead to a major problem in Roman Catholic Church history known as the investiture controversy, which is on the horizon. I'm not going to get into that now, but I want you to know that this is where it's leading. So this is a pattern I told you in several lectures ago that's just going to keep going almost until you get to modern times in the 19th and 20th centuries of who is actually in charge. In this case, is it Charlemagne or is it the Pope?